So now that we have talked about what to do, which markets to target and stuff like that, it's important to also understand how to go about it, especially in the legal aspects. So we have here Shantanu Surpure, who's the managing attorney at Sandhill Council. And we also have Ambarish Gupta, who's the CEO of Nolarity. And they're going to be talking about legal aspects of expanding overseas. Over to Shantanu, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Left side. Just down. Okay. So this topic is really an interesting sign of the times. Just to give a little background, I'm a corporate lawyer. I used to be in Silicon Valley for a number of years. I set up my own firm. I was with a big firm in the Valley, and I set up my own firm focusing on cross-border transactions between India and the U.S. We have offices in Mumbai and Gurgaon, Bangalore, and also the U.S. So what I was saying is this talk today is the reverse of a talk that I used to give about 6 years ago, which was how to set up in India. And now I'm seeing the exact opposite of how to set up overseas. And I think it's just a sign of the times. From what I've seen is that I think there was earlier a lot of inflow into India and excitement about the Indian market. And I think what's happened over time is that the reality is the Indian market is a very challenging market. However, teams here have been able to build very good products, and they're often finding that for a number of reasons, the markets for them are actually more receptive overseas. And a number of the panelists have spoken why in the previous panel why that's so. What I'm going to attempt to do here is give you basically the four questions here: why, how, what, and when, and how to really go about doing this in some fashion at a high level. Here you have an opportunity to hear a lawyer talk for free for half an hour, so it's a good opportunity. So the first question is why would you even do this? Can one of you guys help me push this down? How do you push it down? Oh, okay. This one, okay. Okay, so first question is why would you even want to set up overseas if you're already in India? The main reason, of course, is because the market, the customers. I think what's kind of what I've been hearing around here at this conference is that it's difficult. The market, although in India is very large, it's not necessarily, the people here are not necessarily the earliest adopters of some technologies. The other, I guess, more important issue is the ability or propensity to pay. And that, of course, is a serious issue for most companies simply because you'll get a bigger customer base in that sense abroad. The other rationale is your investors often will prefer it. And often, many of you are speaking to investors, and the first thing they may say is that, and I hear this regularly now, is that your product, your idea, is actually a global product. Why do you limit yourself just to the Indian market? In fact, you might have a bigger market in the global markets. And so that's the other reason is your investors themselves might push you. And so, in fact, almost every single week we're involved in what I call a flip transaction, where we flip the company from India to Singapore or the U.S. or Mauritius or somewhere like that. I'll go into sort of the more detail of how that actually happens. The other is an exit opportunity perspective. Why would you flip? Is because the exit may be greater. Now, the reality is the Indian M&A market or IPO market for tech and internet companies is pretty weak, and there really have been very few exits that really people can just point to, Just Dial being one of them. But the U.S. every single month, every single week, there's an exit in some fashion or other. And so that's the other opportunity. Now, one thing they have liberalized here in the last month or so is the IPO market, where earlier Indian companies could not IPO in the U.S. or outside of India unless they already had an IPO in India. And that was a serious problem because it was very difficult to get an IPO in India for a tech company. They've recently liberalized that, but I've not seen anybody yet take up that opportunity. The other reason a lot of people set up overseas is frankly just a clearer regulatory environment. The thing I've been in here in India in 6 years, and honestly, the environment has not gotten easier. And I would say that most people, in fact, think it's gotten more and more difficult in the last 6 years. The World Bank report came out last week. India actually went down, I think, from 124 to 129. So, in fact, it slipped in the last 5 years. The top 4 countries where it's easiest to do business in the world: Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and the U.S. So I think that's a clear trend that, unfortunately, the reality is that things just haven't been easier from a regulatory environment here, and that's driving people to look at other options. The other issue is that a lot of investors just aren't comfortable. I mean, what's gone on here You see the Vodafone tax case. I think every investor into India continues to mention that as a serious issue where there was a Supreme Court case won, the government passed a retroactive amendment, and investors don't like that. And I think that sort of investor rights, investor protections are much more tested in other jurisdictions. And many of the other things that investors put, I'm a lawyer, so I see all these term sheets, liquidation preference, anti-dilution, all these things that have been imported from Silicon Valley into India, into Indian companies. There's just a complete gray area as to whether any of these even are enforceable, whether any of them have ever worked in India. Anti-dilution, of course, has so many issues with the RBI in terms of how can you issue shares at a lower price, valuation issues. All those things have never really been tested in a court of law, whereas in the U.S. you will find 40 years of court hearings on exactly these points. So that's another reason why I think at least a lot of investors prefer it. Okay, so again, ease of doing business, easier compliance. The other issue that I think for a global business, the single most important reason I hear is that foreign capital controls. I think one of the biggest issues in India is that money going into India and money going out of India. I mean, people always ask me, what's the biggest difference between your practice of law in the U.S. versus the practice of law in India? And in the U.S., the issue is really around securities issues, where you have even a private company is subject to SEC laws. And that's changing a little bit with crowdfunding, but that's the single biggest issue. The biggest issue in India is not that. The biggest issue is money going in and money going out. If an investor comes into India, there are regulations, evaluation, and all sorts of norms that have to be followed. If money is going out of India, then it's another issue. And it's a very time-consuming process to send money in or money out. And if you are dealing with global markets and you have an Indian company and you're trying to send money in or out, it's subject to a lot of restrictions, and therefore it may be just frankly easier from a cost of doing business perspective to be in an environment, Singapore, for example, where it's a free country in terms of capital flow. There are no restrictions on that. The other is a global talent pool. World is flat, so you can hire talent from anywhere to do anything. So I think the factors of all those sort of 4 or 5 points that I mentioned before will lead you to choose a particular jurisdiction. And I'll give you some of the most popular options that I see. So these are some of the legal structures. Now, often a lot of companies, when they start out, they are in India, and so therefore they set out with an Indian company. So this is the standard structure. You have an Indian company as the parent, and then if you want to do business elsewhere, and you decide that you're taking that market seriously, you can set up a subsidiary in the U.S. Now, the most common jurisdiction is Delaware. 99.9% of companies will set up in Delaware. I do run across companies that are in other jurisdictions, California, Illinois, Wyoming, North Carolina. And usually, I think people end up later shifting to Delaware invariably. And in fact, we do a number of transactions where it's almost like another country. The U.S. is a very different place in the sense that each state has a separate law. So if you're a California company and you want to switch to Delaware, then you actually have to do a merger between the two entities. They're completely different. Even the laws are different. So it's important to figure out where you want to be and why. The only exception to that is if you're getting a government grant or something where the state of Indiana is giving you a grant. Singapore is another popular alternative for subsidiaries, particularly if you're targeting Southeast Asia. This is another structure that we see often. So often it gets flipped, where you had an Indian parent. Now we flip it to where the parent company is in the U.S., for example. Then underneath that, often you have Singapore on one side, or you have Mauritius on the other side. And the reason is because of a tax treaty between Singapore and India, and Mauritius and India. Now, of course, there's been a lot of debate and talk about both of these treaties. In particular, the Mauritius-India tax treaty has been the subject of a lot of debate and whether it'll be repealed and all that. However, that is the current law of today. It is still in force, and so it is a valid agreement. And I still see a number of companies setting up in one or the other. I think, of course, Mauritius was more popular earlier. Singapore certainly has caught up in terms of popularity, and we're seeing a lot of interest in Singapore in particular. But a lot of the older entities have set up in Mauritius. And then underneath that, you would have your Indian company. One point to note is that if you are going to flip the structure, it's better to do it earlier than later. The longer you wait, the more tax issues there are and the more complications there are. And I've seen companies that have kind of delayed it, and then at that point it almost becomes too late and there's a higher price to pay. So I think it's that adage that take the pain earlier and you'll appreciate it later. The other alternative is, if you aren't focused on the U.S., one alternative is use Singapore, Mauritius, Cayman Islands. These are some other jurisdictions which are popular as a parent company. And then you have India underneath that. And that is something I see for companies where the U.S. isn't their primary market. Some of the other key considerations, the tax considerations, where you have at the entity level, and the reason a lot of these jurisdictions are popular, Singapore in particular, is because the taxes are relatively lower. A corporate tax rate is quite low. Same in Mauritius. U.S. actually is fairly high. It's 30-something% as a federal level, and then Delaware doesn't really have much if you don't do much business in Delaware. But it's not a low tax country for sure. I think there are other reasons why people choose the U.S., and that's just because their market is there. The other issue that's to be noted is the transfer pricing issues between the parent company and the subsidiary. So how do you get money between the two entities? It's usually a transfer pricing where one entity is providing services for the other entity. And that's the subject of a huge amount of debate. In fact, India has 70% of the world's litigation on transfer pricing. And so now the government has tried to rationalize that in some way by setting out standards in terms of a cost-plus arrangement where you have to, if company A is doing services for B, you need to do it at a cost plus some percentage. And there was a lot of debate whether it's 5%, 10%, 20%. And so a lot of the litigation was centered around that. And so hopefully that will get clarified to some extent. The other issue is, employee taxation. It's a very live example of when employees are going between different countries, how many days they stay there. If they stay in one country more than another, then it can result in what's called a permanent establishment issue, and that entity becomes taxable in that country, and it becomes a problem from a tax point of view. So a lot of executives who are involved in this are very careful about the number of days they spend in India or they spend outside of India, depending on what your strategy is. So you have to take that into consideration about taxation. And the other is GAR, General Anti-Avoidance Rules, which has again been the subject of a lot of debate, and ultimately the government punted it to April 2016. But that was, again, regarding how these structures are derived, and if you are sitting in India and you have a Singapore or a Delaware entity, where's the control of that entity, and if it's in India, do these structures even work? So that is a very live issue, and there's multiple strategies to deal with it. A lot of people have just kind of said, well, we'll deal with it in 2016. The other is some people have been proactive and they've moved their CEO to the U.S. or Singapore or elsewhere to kind of deal with these strategies, and they make sure they're very careful about the number of days they spend and where the control of the entity is. The other issue is immigration and employment. It's a very live issue. In the U.S. in particular, immigration is on the front foot after this recent budget fight. The next thing that will be, I think, discussed is going to be immigration. So U.S., the immigration system is clearly a difficult one to deal with. There has been talk of a startup visa. That's not currently the state of the law. Unfortunately, now you just have H-1 visas and L-1 visas. And a lot of companies have gotten into trouble about the way they've used those visas. So it is something to consider in a way. Singapore is easier than the U.S., but even there has been a lot of protests from locals regarding the use of visas and work permits for foreigners. And so it is something to consider. So this is what I mentioned. In Singapore, you have P1 and P2. Germany, in fact, had a blue card scheme where they were letting skilled workers in. Again, the U.S., what I mentioned was about the startup visa, which is something that I think will be part of the overall immigration reform in the U.S. that will be taken up either hopefully this year or early next year. The other thing that I think a lot of companies overlook or don't spend enough time understanding is when you set up overseas and you have people overseas, is that you are now subject to a lot of other legal issues than you would be if you were then just a pure Indian company. For example, in Europe and in the U.S., employment issues are very serious issues, and wrongful termination is a very serious issue. And litigation works differently in other countries. Here, I think people will take their time to sue, and the legal system moves slowly, so the threat of litigation is not that serious here necessarily. However, in the U.S., it's very easy to file a suit. The court system works fairly quickly, and judgments are rendered fairly quickly. So people won't hesitate to file a suit. Of course, not every claim is genuine, but in general, you have to be very careful about discrimination, wrongful termination. Sexual harassment is a very big deal, and a number of Indian companies, I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about, have had problems with sexual harassment cases in the U.S., resulting in millions of dollars of claims. So it's a serious issue with that. Worker safety is another issue. Somebody slips and falls in your office in the U.S., you're subject to a $2 million lawsuit. That's not going to happen here, but another very serious thing to think about is insurance in the U.S. And worker safety issues, even if you're a tech company. So some of those issues, particularly more if you're a manufacturing company. Insurance issues, again, related to that. Product safety, we talked about. Immigration, I just talked about. So customers, again, product liability is another serious issue. This is probably less important for a software technology company, but if you are a manufacturer, for sure. I mean, Ranvaxy, everyone has read about the problems that they've had, deficiency in service. Again, the U.S. is a litigation-oriented environment. There are a lot of lawyers in the U.S., and there people are quick to file lawsuits. So to be very careful about that. I'm focused more on the U.S. in this talk, just because I think that's where I think the biggest market is. In other countries, litigation is of course, obviously there, probably less so in some of the other countries. The other issue is IP conflict and IP infringement. I think that's another issue, is when you are setting up overseas, you need to make sure that you have the trademarks in place in that country, because now you're doing business in that country. And you want to make sure that a local player there doesn't come and say, well, you've shown up, and I already have the trademark for this, for your name or your logo. So I see this a lot where Indian company has set up in India, they want to go overseas, they set up overseas, and they realize that whatever they had, the name they were using, somebody in that country already has it. So then it's very difficult. They have to rebrand or buy that person out. So it's not so easy. The other issue is M&A, and I just mentioned this case because it's a live case right now. You've probably been reading about this Apollo Tires case, which is going on now, where there's a litigation between the two on an M&A deal. I have to wrap this up. But the last thing I think that's a very sort of practical issue is, how do you set up banking and finance? I think I get approached a lot by Indian companies who want to set up something in the U.S., like a payment gateway issue. They have a lot of U.S. customers. How do the U.S. customers pay? Do you need a payment gateway? All of those issues. And if you need a payment gateway, then do you need a U.S. bank account? So if you need a U.S. bank, how do you do that? And I think it has become more difficult in the U.S. simply because of money laundering, anti-money laundering, and KYC requirements, and all of those things. It is still possible, I think, in some cases, if you have a strong relationship with a bank, to do it without actually going. However, I have many clients who just simply, if the business is important enough, then they'll go and they'll spend a week in the U.S. or Singapore and open a bank account. I think that's just probably the fastest way to go do it. There's no other alternative necessarily. However, it can be done, and usually in order to have a bank account, you typically do have to have an entity in that country. So that is something that I think a lot of people basically they end up doing, simply because if you want to do business in that country and get payments in that country, you have to set up an entity in that country. But again, the risk reward, once you set up an entity in that country, you're subject to all the rules, regulations, and lawsuits and liabilities of that country. So something just to be very, very sure that you understand. And last thing is just on the timing. If you intend to do this, at least the flip structure, then again, I would advise someone to do it sooner. Don't take 3 rounds of funding from VCs and then try and flip. It's just very difficult from a tax position. Try and do it earlier, or even if you want to set it up from day one, that's another option. Okay, thank you. I think Ambarish will speak now.
Thanks, Shantanu. This is very good structure that you have put together. Just the introduction of myself and the company. I am CEO and founder of Nolarity Communications. Many of you guys might know we are a 4-year-old company. It's very relevant to the topic because we just went to Singapore. We are a 4-year-old company, had been an Indian company for some time, and I was just looking at this, the point that Shantanu really went through. Many of those things we actually are experiencing. So I want to kind of talk about this story, real story of in last 8-9 months of switching Nolarity from an Indian company to a Singaporean company. Really the logic for us, if I'll talk about the whys, the logic for us was right from the beginning when we started, we wanted to be an emerging market company. And which basically means all of the APAC region, Asia region, Latin America, Southeast Asia, US market and Western European market, that had not been the part of the vision of the company. So when we are looking, very first thing was, do we want to continue to remain an Indian company? And the answer was no, because as we go to Malaysia and Thailand and Philippines, the subsidiaries in those places reporting to Indian headquarters was very difficult from regulatory point of view.
That was the money in and money out issue that I mentioned.
Yeah. So there's whole bunch of issues around, not only just financial issues, but regulatory issues, credibility issues also there. So we said, we need to have a headquarter outside India, and then we need to make a decision between Singapore, which is and the US, which is kind of de facto standard. And that is where the logic comes in, where the company should be based. We figured that our company is going to be more Asia focused, emerging market focused. It doesn't really make sense for us to go to US. Another advantage in Singapore is that you have a lot of tax advantages, and there's a lot of advantages in terms of access to capital at a very, very low rate. So for example, in India, if you take a debt, it will come out to be in a high, low tens or some teens numbers that you end up getting, double-digit numbers. But if you take the debt in Singapore, it's single-digit number. Now, for a startup, that's very important because if you have access to capital, you can hire people and you can get work done. So, very clean regulatory regime, very easy to set up the headquarter. The company formation was very, very easy. Literally took like 1 week for us to set up a Singapore entity. But the process afterward had been very messy. If we had started with Singapore itself right from the beginning, it had been very clean process. But given we did it after 4 years, we are going through very messy process of, there's something called demerger, in setting up a separate entity, and then one entity merging in other entity, and then ultimately both Indian entities start reporting to Singapore entity while maintaining the tax losses, which is very important. So if you do it in the beginning, it's all clean. But if you do it something like us after 3-4 years, you want to protect, you have probably raised a lot of investment. We raised close to 45 crore rupees of investment so far. And when you have investment, you are putting in money and making losses. And the losses are very valuable because you can, those tax losses, the losses that you claim, ultimately when you start making money, you can claim those losses against the tax. Right? So you want to protect that. But if you were to go and switch from Indian company to Singaporean company or US company right in the middle of your journey, it really, you lose all the losses. So you basically go through very long, legal process to make sure that you can protect those losses and make use of. Those losses are worth $5-6 million. So it's a significant amount. So going through that process, but in terms of, I would say, I think the very first reason for us was, do we want to be an outside India company? And that was, really yes, because we really wanted to serve in outside India market. The second was how to do it, where to do it, and then Singapore versus US, and then some people actually also talked about Ireland as a potential, very high quality place that we can be. For us, the decision actually come out based on which market we wanted to serve. Given we wanted to serve APAC market besides Singapore. The third was, how do we want to do it? Do we want to do it long, complex process, but protect all our tax losses and do it, but at the end you have a very, very clean kind of structure, versus do it quickly and let go of our losses? We decided that we had a lot of resources available to us. We have venture capital with us who had whole, big legal team and the expertise around it. We said, we'll take the complex route, but we'll make sure that we are able to take every benefit that we had accrued in Indian entity and take it to Singapore. That is how we ended up doing. I think the current problems or current issues that we are handling in this one is the visa issue that you briefly talked about. Fortunately, Singapore is very, very liberal visa regime, so that is easy to solve. Hiring people in that region, setting up transfer pricing, just adds a lot of complexity. What is going to be, for example, profits of Indian entity and what is going to be profit of the Singaporean entity? IP, who is going to hold the IP? When the litigation happen, who is going to be responding to those litigations? So we're handling all these complex issues. Fortunately, we have resources currently to handle these complex issues, but there's a whole bunch of them. I would say, so I would bundle all of these issues around what I call legal and regulatory issues. If you do it in the beginning, it's very clean. If you do it later, hopefully you'll have resources to be able to do it. The other set of issues that we end up handling is what I call operating issues. So operating issues will be language and hiring people. So if you're setting up, let's say, a Middle East entity or a Singaporean entity, the very first problem comes is how do you hire people? Like you have one entity and you go there for you go there for 2 months. The way we ended up solving this problem was hire local recruiters to hire us employees. And hiring local recruiters also doesn't really work that smoothly. But that is at least a better bet really to take versus sending people here from India and having them do the work.